All right, Rabosai, good evening, a gezinten Zimmer. Hopefully everyone had a meaningful and uplifting Tisha B'Av, and now Baruch Hashem, it is a schus to begin our journey towards Shabbos Nachamu, to begin our journey towards Nechama, to begin our journey towards Mashiach together in Maseches Basra. Today's daf, meaning Tuesday's daf, is daf Memtes 49. We're in Meretz Hashem, we have an ambitious goal for tonight. Memtes and Nun. We're not going to rush, but we'll also move at an expeditious pace. So we'll say, so today's daf, we're starting Tuesday's daf, Memtes. So we are picking up on the bottom of Memches Base 48b, and we are actually picking up two lines up from the bottom, just to reorient ourselves a little bit. There was an interesting case with two guys, one by the name of Tabi, one by the name of Papoi. Tabi was a powerful guy. He coerced Papoi to go ahead and sell him. In this case, it was a kinrad, a tree, particular tree. Or, right, actually, years 2 years so in the Rashbam in terms of what he coerced him to sell. But again, the truth is the object itself is even somewhat irrelevant. So what happens? So of course, then again, Papai has no choice but to go ahead and sell, so he does. Meanwhile, what ended up happening? Rabbah went ahead and signed on two documents. One was the document of sale, and the other one was what we call a moda'ah. Moda'ah means a document of objection. Now, literally what that means is when a person goes in and says, I'm being coerced to sell, and that's and by a tremendous Yeshchach to Rabbi Ari Lerner for the refreshments tonight. Incredible. I don't think he went home. I think this is when he's breaking his fast on. So, sorry, but thank you. And also tremendous thank you to Moshe Abramson, who Mamish worked so hard over last night, today, Baruch Hashem, to make sure that everything really technologically went well. So we're very lucky to have such a wonderful chevra. So in any event, so Rabbah goes ahead and signs on two documents. One document said that Papoi went ahead and made a modah. He objected to going ahead and selling, and he put that in print in a document that he was being coerced to sell. The other one, of course, the other document was the document of sale itself. So the Shaila, of course, so then again the Gemara essentially said that halacha l'maisa, had Rav Huna not signed on the modah, ultimately the sale would have been valid. Why? Because Rav Huna is of the opinion that even a coerced sale is still a valid sale. Remember again, this is the opinion of Rav Huna. I know Monday feels like many moons ago, but on Monday morning when we did this daf, this is the famous position of Rav Huna of Tal Yuha v'Zabin Zvine, that if you coerce someone to sell, ultimately, the sale is a valid sale. Rav Huna's essential idea is because every sale really incorporates some element of coercion, because a person would never really go ahead and sell something if they didn't have to. As such, a coerced sale is a good sale. So the Gemara says, Ini, is this so? Is this so? Now, if you look at the Rashbam says, Ini, kilomar heich batla moda'a shechasam barabba bar barchana, es hashkalta shechasam hu atzmo. So now, remember again, so what the Gemara suggests over here is that the sale between Tabi and Papoi was invalid. Why was it invalid? Because Tabi had gone ahead and, got the name exactly. So Papoi had gone ahead and written a modah. So because he signed on that modah, on that document, ultimately again saying that he did not want to sell, therefore again that invalidated the document of sale itself. So the Gemara says, Ini, is that so? That a signed modah will go ahead and a signed modah will invalidate the document of sale. So the Gemara says, Rav Nachman said as follows, both said last line 48b. Ha'idim shamru amana hayu dvareinu. Watch this. If witnesses said, we signed on a shtar amana. Now both said, now what's the shtar amana? Shtar amana is a fascinating document that says, Ruvain lent Shimon $1,000. There's only one problem, and witnesses sign on it. There's only one issue. Ruvain didn't lend Shimon $1,000. Ruvain plans on lending Shimon $1,000, or Ruvain perhaps will lend Shimon $1,000. Now, from Ruvain's perspective, Ruvain's like, look, I got to get this document, or I really, from the borrower's perspective, right? I got to get this document drawn up now. Everybody's around, the lender, the borrower, the witnesses. Let me just get this done. I will say that is called the shtar amana. Now remember, what is the shtar amana? What does it depend on? It depends on the honesty and integrity of the lender. That the lender, because that's an easily exploitable situation where the lender could go ahead and halacha l'maisa produce a document that says that Ruvain lent money to Shimon, and it's easily exploitable. So we do not produce a shtar amana. You cannot go ahead and essentially create a prospective loan document, because the document has to reflect the reality that occurred, especially at the time that the witnesses sign it. So to write a document that represents something that may occur in the future, and to have witnesses sign on that that is highly problematic. So therefore, again, the Gemara says as follows: if witnesses say, now, both say, just here's the case. We have a loan document. The loan document says that Reuven lent Shimon $1,000, and it's signed by witness A and witness B. And the witnesses say, the truth is, this transaction never happened. It's a shtar amona. We filled this out proactively, prospectively, and in the event that one day Reuven lends Shimon money. What's the halacha? Top of Memtes 49a, we're flying, ein ne'amanin. Ultimately, again, they're not believed. They're not believed. Yet, moda hayu dvarenu. Let's say, again, I won't say, let's say the witnesses say that it's true that we went ahead and we signed on this document, but it was a coerced transaction, and therefore we have a moda. Right, that ultimately, again, the whatever it is, the seller or the borrower, right, or really the seller works, or the seller was coerced, and therefore it's a moda. Ein ne'amanin. Ultimately, again, they're not believed. So I will say, what do you see from here? You see from here that when witnesses come along, if you have a document that says a transaction occurred, and then witnesses say, but by the way, the transaction was under duress, we don't believe the witnesses. So how does that stem with what happened on Amud Beis? Gemara says, no, big difference. Oh, I will say very, very big difference. When do we not believe witnesses to say that there was a moda, that this was under duress? When there is no documentation to support that duress assertion. So for example, let's say we have a document. The document says, Reuven sold Shimon a field. And then the witnesses say, it's true, Reuven did sell Shimon a field, but Reuven was coerced. Reuven was coerced. Now, there's no documentation backing that up. There's no document backing that up. There's just a statement. Halacha l'maisa, that we do not believe the witnesses. Why? Because Rabbi say a document is a document is a document. And a document is going to hold water against the statement of the witnesses. So a moda cannot undermine a document when the document is in writing and the moda is verbal. On the other hand, aval b'shtara, asi shtara umar l'shtara. But that's different. We'll say, but what happens to the following? Let's say Reuven sold the field to Shimon, and there's a document that says that he sold it to Shimon, but there's also a document that records that Reuven sold under duress. Okay, that works, right? Why does that work? Because the shtar of the moda, right, the shtar represent, we'll call it the coercion shtar, the shtar that highlights the coercion is in writing, and therefore again that can undermine the authenticity of the document of sale. Coming full circle, that's the case over here with Tabai and Papai. Right, Tabi forced Papai to go ahead and sell the tree. Again, that coercion was recorded in a document. Even though there was also a document of sale, because the coercion was recorded in a document, that we'll call it the coercion document, has the ability to go ahead and undermine the authenticity of the sale document. Makes perfect sense. But if all you have is a sale document, and the fact that coercion happened is what we'll call bal peh, it's just somebody signing this over, but there's no documentation for it. So reported coercion cannot undermine a bona fide document, which also makes sense. I also want to point out something very interesting, which is you have to understand, we have to be very careful with this coercion thing, right? Why? Because if you think about it, it is easily exploitable. Right? Think about this for just a moment. Any person who gets into a transaction and then has, seller's remorse, right? Seller's remorse, buyer's remorse, could claim what? I was coerced. And that's very dangerous. You could really undermine the very foundation of just transactions. So that's why Rav Huna, when Rav Huna says that a coerced transaction stands, it's not Rav Huna being indifferent to the difficulty or pain that people undergo, but rather, again, it's Rav Huna saying, listen, for transactional law to work, we have to be able to rely on a shtar. And if there's a shtar that says that the item was sold, then that's what we go with. Now, Einachinami, if you do have the coercion recorded in a document, even Rav Huna will agree that that will undermine the authenticity of the transaction. So Rabosai, so for our purposes right now, you have two things to remember. Only two things in the entire world. These are for the next hour, not even hour. Yankee, I don't want to avoid contact with Yankee, right? For the next couple of minutes, right, that we're going to be in shir. So there are two things to remember. Number one, Rav Huna says a coerced sale is a sale. That's number one, okay? And therefore, again, if someone claims coercion, essentially the halakha says we don't care. When's the one time we care about coercion, or coercion can undermine the authenticity of a transaction? If the coercion was recorded in a document, right? So if Reuven's selling Shimon a field, and Reuven says, okay, Eidim, we're going to sign the document, and Reuven says to the Eidim, guys, I'm being coerced, and I need you to record this in a document that I'm being coerced to do this, then the coercion document undermines the authenticity of the actual transaction. Beautiful. Let's go back to Gufa Amrav Nachman. Amanu hayadvarenu ein ne'emanin, moda hayadvarenu ein ne'emanin. So Rabbi says, Rav Nachman just said before, if witnesses come along, right? So there's a document that says Reuven lent Shimon $1,000, and the witnesses say, you know what? It's what's called the shtar amona. We never actually saw Reuven lend $1,000. Reuven said he was going to lend Shimon $1,000, so we figured let's go ahead and write up the shtar already. But we never actually saw the document. We just assumed the transaction was going to happen, and no one was going to produce the document before the actual transaction occurred. If witnesses say that, we do not believe them. We take a document at its face value. Similarly, again, Modah, same idea. Witnesses witness a transaction, and the witnesses claim it was under coercion. Unless the coercion is recorded in a document, we don't believe them either. So the Gemara goes back to Umar Bar Avashi says, Amana hayadvarinu ein ne'emanin. So listen to this. So Umar Bar Avashi says, if witnesses claim that the document was a shtar amana, so again, we have a document that says Reuven lent Shimon $1,000. The witnesses are claiming that we never actually saw the loan occur. We just wrote this in the event that the loan occurs, a shtar amana. We trust the parties not to produce it until it's an actual transaction. So Mar Bar Avashi says, we do not believe the witnesses. However, Modah hayu dvarinu ne'emanin. If the witnesses say that the transaction was coerced, we do believe them. Now both say, apparently the Chiddush over here is we do believe them even if what? Even if what? Even if the coercion is not in writing. So Gemara says, my taima, what's the reason for that? Shazeh nita, I'm sorry, I take that back. If they have a modah, we do believe them. My taima, what's the difference? Shazeh nita mekasev, v'zeh lo nita mekasev. So there's a very big distinction. What's the big distinction? That at the end of the day, a shtar amana should have never been written to begin with. Shtar amana should have never been written. Rabbi, you're not allowed to write a shtar like that. However, Rabbi, a shtar modah, or I should say, a coerced transaction could be committed to writing even if it's coerced. Why? Because we also said generally where there is coercion, right, that means again, so one party is taking advantage of a different party. Usually again, the coerced party doesn't have the ability to get out of the transaction, otherwise he wouldn't be coerced. So the idea over here is in a coerced transaction, the idea of writing down a moda'ah is permissible. It's permissible and it's even encouraged because that's the way that the coerced party is going to be able to get out of it. So therefore, interestingly enough, Mar Bar Avashi says we never believe witnesses that a shtar is a shtar amana because it is illegal to write a shtar amana. We will believe witnesses that something is a shtar moda'ah. Why? Because it is permitted and maybe even proper to write the shtar moda'ah. If you're witnessing a transaction and you know that one of the parties ultimately is being coerced, and that party asks you, the coerced party asks you to commit the coercion to writing or to document the coercion in writing, it is the right thing to do so. Incredible, incredible. So what's that? I'm sorry? Right, true, very true, very true. Beautiful. Okay, let's go back there. Says the Gemara, V'lo ish chazaka b'nichsei ishto. Ultimately, again, a man does not have the ability to establish a chazaka in his wife's property. So we'll say, so we spoke about this before. Remember again, what does chazaka require? Chazaka requires really three things. We always said two, but it's really three. Number one, taina. How did you get here? How did you get to his property? Number two, duration. And really number three, there has to be that there's no other reason for you to be in this property other than the fact that you're the owner. But if there's another good reason that you're in this property, then you can't establish chazaka. So the paradigmatic case, for example, is a sharecropper. Right? The sharecropper can't establish chazaka because, of course, my sharecropper claims that he's the owner of my land. Of course, you've been in my land for 3 years uncontested. You work for me. So the similar idea applies in marriage. That a husband, for example, and this goes both ways, a husband v'lo ish b'chazaka b'nichsei ishto. A man, a husband, cannot establish a chazaka in his wife's property. Why not? Because again, a husband uses his wife's property, a wife uses her husband's property, and therefore again, no one's really making a macha one against the other. It's natural for them to use each other's property, and therefore there's no chazaka. Says the Gemara, Pshita, that's obvious. Kevan de islay pera lepera peruhuda ka'achel. It's obvious, we'll say, because let's analyze this. Let's assume we're talking about a case of a field, right? So what is the husband, how is the husband utilizing his wife's field? How is he utilizing it? He's going and he's consuming the produce. Well, guess what? He's entitled to produce. He's entitled to produce, right? A Baal, a husband, is entitled to consume the produce of his wife's property. So of course he can't establish chazaka like that because he's utilizing something that belongs to him. To which the Gemara says, Lo tzricha the kas of law din udvarim eli b'nechsayich. No, what's the case? The case is where the husband doesn't have peros. Why doesn't the husband have peros? Because he wrote to his wife, din udvarim eli b'nechsayich. I have nothing to do with your property. So essentially, again, he's like giving up the right to peros. The Gemara says, 1 second. We've seen this for Rabbi Say, I don't understand. So you're telling me that if a man has peros in his wife's property, and then he writes the statement, din udvarim eli b'nechsayich, that I don't have any rights in your property, that's it? He's given up, he's yielded his rights, but we learned, v'atanya omer lechaver din udvarim eli asadezu, ve'eli esek ba v'yadim misulak esemen lo amar klum. Yet Rabbi Say, we learned that if you have partners, Reuben and Shimon are partners in a field, and Reuben goes ahead and says to Shimon, I have nothing to do with this field. I have no involvement in this field, right? Din udvarim, nothing to do with it. My hands are removed from it. Ultimately, again, such a statement is absolutely meaningless. Such a statement is meaningless. So I'll say, again, we've spoken about this before, that when you have an ownership interest or some type of interest in something, simply deciding that I'm out doesn't work. Doesn't work. If you have a right or you're vested in something, the only way to divest yourself of that is by utilizing some type of halachic mechanism. But to simply say, it's not mine, right? To simply say that it doesn't belong to me, that doesn't work. So in other words, a husband has peros in his wife's property. So if he doesn't want the peros, there's a way to do that, but saying, I'm out, dinu dvar me'elni al sadezu, doesn't work. Doesn't work. So what's the case? Again, we spoke about this. This is the Musar Haskell. We've spoken on this a number of different times, that when you have an issue in life, saying that it's not my issue, or just simply absenting yourself from dealing with the issue does not work. Does not work. Reuven and Shimon are partners. Reuven wants to get out of the partnership, saying, okay, I'm done. No, there's a mechanism. You have an issue in life. You have to work it through if you want resolution. Simply absolving yourself of the problem, simply saying, I'm not involved, does not work. So, Amrila, Arviana, Masnisa Mikosev Lava Odarusa. Oh, no, we'll say, watch this. What's the case? The case is here where the husband doesn't have peros. So we'll say, so again, remember, let's just analyze what's happening over here. Here's the progression. Mishnah said, husband doesn't have rights in his wife's property. The Gemara says, of course he doesn't. Why would he have rights? Well, in other words, let's play this out. How Reuven's married to Rachel. How is Reuven claiming chazaka? How is he claiming chazaka? How is he claiming chazaka? Right? 3 years. Right? He's consuming the peros of the field for 3 years. Yeah, and what? You're entitled to peros. You're entitled to peros. How could that be demonstrative of chazaka? Oh, the Gemara says, no, he doesn't have peros. Well, how doesn't he have peros? Someone says, oh, he said, Dinu Dvar Elias, I have nothing to do with this field. That doesn't work. That doesn't take away, that doesn't, so to speak, divest him of his peros rights. But what's a good case? I'm going to read the Bianai. Masnisim bekosev lava oda arusa. Interestingly enough, the Mishnah is talking about a case. We'll say, what can he do? While they're still in Erisin, while they're still in the initial stage of marriage. Now remember again, a husband only gets the rights to his wife's produce when? During Nisuin. But during Erisin, what he could do is, before he gets those rights, he could deny himself those rights. He could kind of absent himself from them. Rav Kahana says, well, say, I'm a base, then when a person has literally, nachla literally means an inheritance, but in this context it means a right. When a person has a right that is coming to him from somewhere, he has the ability to go ahead and prevent that right from vesting. In other words, once you already have peros, you need a mechanism in which to disentangle yourself from the peros. If you don't yet have peros, then you have the ability to kind of block the right from ever vesting. So therefore, during Erisin, when a husband does not yet have rights, peros rights, in his wife's property, he could say, no thank you, I don't want it. And the simple no thank you prevents it from vesting. So therefore, also the Gemara is suggesting over here is that halacha l'maisa, the case in the Mishnah must be a case where the husband went ahead and, during Erisin, said no thank you to the peros, right? I don't want the peros. I I don't want the peiros. Therefore, again, the right never vested. And because the right never vested, I might have thought that maybe consumption of peiros for 3 years does establish chazaka. Kamashmal, no, a husband never establishes chazaka in his wife's produce. I'll say it's also a tremendous Musar Haskell in this. If you think about this in just a moment, this idea of person can stipulate that a right that is not yet vested has the ability or doesn't vest. So what that means is in life, if you are proactive in dealing with your challenges. In other words, if a person is roa as hanolad, person sees what's coming down the pike, a person is able to see what problems are going to materialize before they actually materialize, you could proactively deal with things and prevent them from ever becoming problems in the first place. If you don't deal with your life issues, and the issues vest, they vest in you, they vest in your life, it's a much more complicated process to go ahead and resolve them. But if you are roa es hanolad, if you see things coming down the pike, and you see problems as they emerge before they vest in your life, and you proactively deal with them, you can neutralize the problems sometimes even before they become your own problems. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, because Rabbi says in general, you know, if halacha gave you something, if halacha gave you a particular right, you have if halacha gave you, we'll call it an entitlement, you have the ability to say what? No, thank you. No, thank you. So therefore, a husband during Erusin has the ability to say no, thank you to the peiros that technically would become his once there are nisuin. My kigon zos. What is kigon zos? Kid Rav Huna, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav Yichol Isha Shetamar L'Bayla Einen Izonis Ve'eni Osa. So it's like Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, because Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, a woman can say to her husband, don't support me and I am not working. In other words, I will say the halacha is that a husband is obligated to go ahead and provide support for his wife. In return, Chazal said that she has to give her earnings to her husband. While the woman can say, listen, you instituted this for my benefit. No, thank you, I don't want the support. I will say, by the way, cases like this come up all the time where you have a wife who makes more money than her husband. So she wants to keep the money. I'm not interested in handing over my earnings. Thank you for your willingness to support me. I can take care of myself. So she has the right to say, thank you, this is an entitlement that is due to me. No, thank you, I don't want the right. So the point over here is you see that you could be entitled to something, and yet you could say, no, thank you. Now we'll say now, okay, fine. So remember, all of this is trying to interpret in the Mishnah, what's the case of where a husband can't establish chazaka in his wife's property. The Gemara says, ha raya yesh. Now I will say that's something very interesting here. So what comes out of this is, let's say a husband is able to produce proof. Let's say he's able to produce proof that he did purchase a field from his wife. He purchased property from his wife. So it sounds like if he's able to produce proof to that effect, that he can create chazaka. So the Gemara says, 1 second, how is that so? Tema. But there's an issue. What's the issue? Why can't she say, nachas rachasisi lebaili? Even if the husband can produce proof that he sold a field to his wife, aren't we concerned that she could turn around and say, yeah, I quote unquote sold him, there's a document, but it's not really a transaction. You know what? I didn't want him to get upset. I didn't want to create shalom bayis problems. So he wanted to buy it from me. I sold it to him. Nachas ruach hasisi lebayli means I wanted to keep things calm. I wanted to keep my husband happy. So you want to buy the field? Here, buy the field. But I did not actually mean to commit transactionally. After all, we learned milotnan. Did we not learn? Lakach min ha'ish v'chazar lakach min ha'isha mekcho batal. Listen to this. Let's say I go over to Reuven's married to Rachel. I buy a piece of property from Reuven. What's the issue with Reuven's property? Any married man's property is be careful how you answer this one, right? Is encumbered. Everything he owns is encumbered to the ksuva, to his wife. So what happens? Let's say I go over to Reuven and purchase the field. Now I'm a chacham, so I decide, you know what, I'm also going to go back to Rachel and purchase it from Rachel, kind of buy out her encumbrance. Then what's the halacha? Mekcho batal. The sale is not good, which is very intriguing. Now, why is this sale not good? I bought it from Reuven and from Rachel. Alma amra nachas ruach hasisi lebayli. Hachanami tema nachas ruach hasisi lebayli. Why? Because what are we concerned about? We're concerned that even though I went back and bought it from Rachel, Rachel's going to say, I didn't really want to sell it to you, but I didn't want to get into an argument with my husband. So therefore, again, I just agreed to sell it, but I didn't really mean to consent to the transaction. So too over here, I will say we should say that even if halacha l'maisa, he brought a raya. Husband, Reuven brought a raya, brought a shtar, that he bought a field from his wife Rachel. It shouldn't work. Why shouldn't it work? Because she could always say, Nachas ruach asisi labaili. I was just trying to make my husband happy, preserve shalom bayis, but it wasn't a real sale. To which the Gemara says, Ha'itmar Allah amra barafuna, lo nitzucha ella ba'osan gimel sados. So we'll say, so now watch this. Actually, okay, we'll say, Shkoyach, this brings to a close today's daf. Shkoyach, everyone. Mazel tov. Mazel tov. Okay, 1 second. And start. Okay, good. Shkoyach. All right. Now let's say, but there's more. But there's more. All right, so we'll say now we are up to daf nun, which is Emir Hashem tomorrow morning's daf. Ha'itmar Allah. But 1 second, in this concept of nachas ruach asisi labaili, what about the following situation? Ha'itmar Allah amra barafuna lo nitzcha ela ba'osan gimel sados. This concept that a woman could say, let's say again a husband, Ruvain, the husband, furnishes an actual document that says Rachel sold him a piece of land, and now suddenly we're saying that it's not going to work. Why is it not going to work? Because halacha l'maisa, she could always claim nachas ruach asisi labaili. I was only going ahead and making my husband happy. The Gemara says, first of all, even if you say there can be a claim like that, that doesn't apply to all property. It only applies to 3 specific fields. Which 3 specific fields? So field number 1 is a field that they identified in the ksuva as the field that is to be the source of repayment for the ksuva, or source of payment for the ksuva. Top of nun, we'll say 50a. La'achos sheyiche la b'ksuvasa, or another field which was identified but not named in the document itself. So case number 1 is a field that was actively identified in the ksuva as the source for ksuva payment. Case number 2 is a field that was designated but not actively identified in the ksuva itself. Va'achos shechnisa lo shum mishala. And another field that we'll say what we call nichsei tzon barzel. Nichsei tzon barzel is property that a woman brings into a property, that brings into marriage, that of course is hers. She retains title, but not only that, the value of the property itself is locked in. The value is locked in. So we'll say, so these are the 3 cases where if a woman ends up selling these properties to her husband, she could claim it wasn't a true sale, but rather again, nachas ruach asisi labaili. All I was doing was trying to make my husband happy. The Gemara says, Lumi utei, what does this come to exclude? If you say it comes to exclude all other properties, kol shekein dahavila eva, then I will say all the more so that's going to create marital animosity. How so? The Amar La, because he's going to say to her, Einayich nasata begerishin abamisa. You're obviously setting your eyes on either my death or my divorce, right? Demise or divorce. That's why you aren't inquiring about other properties. Elalami ute nichse malug. Rather, it must be coming to exclude nichse malug. Must be coming to exclude nichse malug. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Ha'amar ameimar ish v'isha shemachro b'nichse malug lo asav lo klum. But Ameimar said that if a husband and wife sell nichse malug, now what that means is, I go to the husband and then I go to the wife, and I purchase the property independently from both of them. Lo asav lo klum. Ultimately, again, such a sale is irrelevant. Now, why is such a sale irrelevant? Why is that, Rabbi Say? Because the Gemara says, Ki itmar da ameimar. When is that true? Heicha dezabin ihu umis. That's true ultimately again when he sold it and he died. Asya ihi umafka, then she has the ability to extract the property ultimately again from sellers or from purchasers. Inami zabna ihi umesa, or she sold it and died. Asihiu umafik betakanta derabanan. He has the ability to extract it from purchasers based on takana derabanan. What's the takana? Ba'usha hiskinu ha'isha shemachra b'nichse melog umesa baila umesa habal motzi miad ala kuchos. So we'll say in Usha they made a takana. What was the takana? That a woman who sells off her nichse melog. So again, I both say what's interesting about nichse melog is remember again who owns, who has title to nichse melog? The woman. The woman has title to nichse melog. The husband has peiros. He gets usage. What happens if a woman sells her nichse melog? Is she allowed to do so? Absolutely. There's an interesting takana. What's the takana? That if a woman sells her nichse melog and then she dies, her husband has the ability to extract the nichse melog from the purchasers. Fascinating halacha. Aval heicha tezabninu tarvahu li alma. But if both of them consented to a sale to a third party, inami zabna i lididei, Or if Rachel, the wife, sold it to the husband, zevine, then ultimately again it should work. It should work. So such a transaction actually should. So I'll say, so remember again, I just want to point out what's happening over here. All we're trying to figure out, all we're trying to figure out over here is the Mishnah's case, right? Because the Mishnah is telling us that halacha l'maisa, husband can't establish chazaka in his wife's property. So all we're just trying to figure out is so what would be the case? In other words, what would be the case ultimately where we'd have an havamina where that should be able to occur? So the Gemara is just pointing out, so we went through the entire process of what happens with Peros, and now the Gemara is also simply suggesting that maybe there is a case where a husband can establish chazaka in his wife's property. After all, again, as we've just seen over here, if ultimately, again, a wife sells her property to her husband, it sounds like, at least according to this opinion over here, that it is a valid sale. Now again, what's the tension? The tension is that whenever a wife sells something to her husband, maybe she always has an out. And what's the out? Nachas ruach asisi l'bayli. I was just trying to keep things calm at home, but never meant to ever engage in a real transaction. The other possibility is, Ameimar d'Amar Rabbi Lazar, that Ameimar holds like Rabbi Lazar. And I will say, what did Rabbi Lazar say? So we'll say, so now we're going to get into another topic over here, but we're going to circle back. Desanya, watch this. Hamocheres avda opasak imoshish mishenu shloshim. So watch this. I go, right, Ruvain sells an Eved Kanani. He sells an Eved Kanani to Shimon. Now what happens, we'll say, so this is like with a, I don't know what the technical term is, but like he sold it, but yet he gets to use it. He gets to use it like a rent back, right? So Ruvain sells his Eved to Shimon, but the sale is predicated on Ruvain being able to use the Eved for the next 30 days. Okay, now watch this. Now both say, one other piece over here. There's a halacha called Yom o Yomayim. The halacha is that if a person chas v'shalom kills his Eved Kanani, one is chayiv misa for that. That brings with it a death penalty. Now there's an interesting halacha that says like this. Let's say a person, the master injures his Eved Kanani, but the Eved doesn't die immediately. The Eved dies a day or two later. What's the halacha? The master is absolved from capital punishment. Now I want to point out this is dramatically different than when we injure Jew to Jew injury. Meaning, if Ruvain injures Shimon, right, and Shimon dies of his injuries, even if Shimon dies a year later from his injuries, Ruvain is chayiv in a capital fashion, right? Ruvain is chayiv for killing Shimon. Again, this is obviously assuming that you could attribute Shimon's ultimate demise to the injuries he suffered from Ruvain. But halacha l'maisa, again, it doesn't matter how much time elapses between the injurious event and the resulting death. If there's a clear connection between the event and death, then the perpetrator is chayiv. There's this specific, interesting halacha by Eved Kanani that says if the master kills the Eved Kanani right now, he's chayiv. But if the Eved himself survives for a day or two, then the master is absolved from capital punishment. Okay, so now watch this. This is fascinating. So the Gemara says, Hamochres avdo pasakim shloshim yom. So Ruvain sells his Eved to Shimon, but part of the sale is that Ruvain is going to use it for the next 30 days. And what happens? During those 30 days, Ruvain injures the Eved. Ruvain injures the Eved. Rameir Omer, Harishon Yeshno Bedin Yoma Yomayim. So Rameir says, Ruvain, who is the former owner, now the one who's currently using it for 30 days, Ruvain is subject to the din of Yoma Yomayim. So in other words, if he injures the Eved, and the Eved doesn't die immediately, the Eved only dies a day or two later, Ruvain ultimately again will be pater. Because ultimately again the Eved is serving Ruvain. Eved is serving Ruvain. But the second guy, Shimon, is not subject to the halach of Yoma Yomayim. Why? Because the Eved is not serving him. What do you see from here? Kasabar, kinyan peros, ke kinyan aguftami. So we'll say, we've seen this concept many times before. That is usage tantamount to ownership. Is usage tantamount to ownership? So Meir holds that yes, usage is tantamount to ownership. Therefore, again, Ruvain, although Ruvain is not the titular owner, right? Ruvain doesn't have title because he sold the Eved to Shimon. But when Ruvain has usage during those 30 days, Ruvain becomes essentially the effective owner. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, the din of Yomo Yomayim, this injury of the Eved, Ruvain is subject to it, Shimon is not. Even though Shimon is the titular owner, because Shimon does not have usage, so in Rabbi Meir's worldview, usage equals ownership. Usage equals ownership. Okay. Rabbi Huda says, Hasheni yeshno medin yomi yomayim mipnei shu kaspo. Rabbi Huda says, listen, really it is only Shimon who is the actual owner, who is subject to the law of Yoma Yomayim. But again, that's Shimon. Harishon einu b'din Yoma Yomayim she'eno kaspo. But the first one, Ruvain, who is the former owner, now current renter, is not subject to the halach of Yoma Yomayim. Why? Because the Eved is not his property. What does he hold? Kasavar, kinyan peros, lav kinyan agov. So both say a fundamental machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Huda. Rabbi Meir holds usage. You're going to see why this is what this has to do with anything that we're doing in just a moment. Right? Rabbi Meir holds that usage is the equivalent of ownership. Rabbi Huda holds that usage is not the equivalent of ownership. Kinyan aperos ke kinyan aguf. That's Rabbi Meir. Kinyan peros lav ke kinyan aguf. That's Rabbi Huda. Comes on Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says Omer. Both say Nun Amud Beis 50b. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Shnehem Yeshnan Bedin Yoma Yomayim. This is fascinating. Rabbi Yossi says both Ruvain and Shimon are both subject to the halacha of Yom or Yomayim. Why? Zeh mipnei shu tachtov, v'zeh mipnei shehu kaspo. Ruvain is subject to the law of Yoma Yomayim. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, he currently has usage of the Eved, and Shimon is subject to the law of Yoma Yomayim. Why? Because he is the owner of the Eved. Now, we'll say, in Rabbi Yossi's view, Rabbi Yossi, what's his issue? U'misapkale, I kinyan peres ke kinyan haguf dami, I lav ke kinyan haguf dami, v'safek nefashos lahakel. So we'll say, so Rabbi Yossi is just not sure, right? Whereas Rabbi Meir is definitive that kinyan peros ke kinyan aguf, that usage is like ownership. Therefore, again, Ruvain, the user, is subject to Yomi Yomayim. Shimon, the titular owner, is not. And Rabbi Yehuda is certain that kinyan peros lav ke kinyan aguf. Therefore, Ruvain, the user, is not subject to Yomi Yomayim, but Shimon, the owner, is subject to Yomi Yomayim. Rabbi Yossi himself is not sure. He's not sure. Is usage equivalent to ownership or not? And therefore he's not sure. And therefore what does he say? Both Ruvain and Shimon are subject to the laws of Yom or Yomayim. I just want to point out, remember again, the laws of Yom or Yomayim, it's a kula. It's a kula, right? What it says is that halacha l'maisa, if the Eved doesn't die immediately, he survives a day or two, you are freed from any capital responsibility. That is dafka din in the right? Dafka din in the owner. So therefore, because Rabbi Yossi is not sure, is usage the equivalent of ownership? Therefore, halacha l'maisa, he says both Reuven and Shimon could avail themselves of Yom or Yomayim. Okay, well, say now here we come to it. Rabbi Elazar Omer. Rabbi Elazar says, Shnehem einon bidin Yoma Yomayim. No, neither party ultimately again is subject to the laws of Yom or Yomayim. Why not? Zelafi she'eno tachtov, v'zelafi she'eno kaspo. So Shimon is not subject to Yom Yomayim. Why? Because he doesn't have possession. And Ruvain is not subject to Yom Yomayim. Why? Because he does not have ownership. So I will say what that sounds like according to Rabbi Elazar is, in order to be subject, for this specific instance, in order to be subject to Yom Yomayim, what do you need? Two things. Number one, ownership. Number two, usage. Usage, if you don't have both, then ultimately, again, you are not subject to Yom Yomayim. I will say, now ultimately, again, so what is this here? So we wanted to say that a Meimar holds like Rabbi Elazar. So what does that have to do with anything? So we'll say, so take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. So the Rashbam says over here, well, actually, let's just finish. V'amarava, my time with Rabbi Elazar. What's Rabbi Elazar's logic? Where does he get this from? Amar Kra, lo yukam, ki kaspo hu. So the pasuk says, ultimately again, the master injures the Eved, and ultimately again, he remains alive for ach im yom o yomayim ya'amod. If he goes and he stays alive for another day or two after being injured, lo yukam ki kaspo hu. Literally again, he will not be avenged. Why? Ki kaspohu, for he is the possession of the owner. Now, what does that teach me? The Gemara says, kaspohu, kaspo hamiyuchad lo. In Rabbi Elazar's view, there can only be one owner of the Eved, and that owner must satisfy two criteria. Number one, actual ownership title, and number two, usage. What does this have to do with our sugya? Take a look at the Rashbam. first short line, or last wide line in the Rashbam, then into the short lines. Kikaspahu, listen to this. Miyusahu, demana sinas tam hayitzarach litem bedavar velomar lo yukam lefisha kaspahu. Inami midematzi lemichtav kikasafu mishum hachi nami yolaf ameimar lagab. So I say, fine. So the point over here is kikas. That phrase kikaspahu is an extraneous phrase. Now, what Rabbi Lazar uses it for is to teach me that the only way you're subject to the law of Yoma Yomayim is if that eved is your possession. And what is the definition of possession? Title and usage. Title and usage. So we'll say, what does that have to do with us? Now finish up the Rashbam. Watch this. This is great. So now the Rashbam says, so Mishum Hachi Nami Yolef Ameimar Lagabe Nichse Melug. Dechevan de'ena miyuchad lo leish v'lo leisha eno karoi sada ha'ish v'lo sada isha. So we'll say, now watch this. Rabbi Lazar wants to say that this case over here of the Eved, right? So what happened? Reuven owned it. Reuven sold it to Shimon. But part of the sale was that Reuven gets it back for 30 days. So we'll say, in this scenario, according to Rabbi Lazar, who's the owner of the Eved? Who's the owner? Who's the owner? Neither of them are the owner, right? Because neither one of them has both title and usage. So therefore, the Gemara wants to suggest that Ameimar borrowed this model, and what did he apply it to? Nichse Melug. What's Nichse Melug? Nichse Melug is property that a wife brings into marriage. Who owns the property? Who owns it? Wife. Who gets usage of it? Husband. So what's the status of something where one person holds title and one other person has usage? Who is the owner? Who is the owner? It's not clear. I mean, it is clear. It's both of them and none of them. So both say, therefore, what? Now watch this. Finish up the Rashbam. Therefore, since this field doesn't exclusively belong to the wife or to the husband, it's not called the field that belongs to the husband, nor is it called the field that belongs to the wife. Therefore, therefore, both say, even if halacha l'maisa, you have a case where both of them sold the field, that sale is still going to be invalid. Why is it going to be invalid? Because both parties are selling something that doesn't fully belong to them. So just as in the case of the Eved, neither Reuven nor Shimon owns the field, and therefore again in this limited conversation over here, neither will be subject to the laws of Yom or Yomayim. Ameimar wants to suggest this is the same issue with going ahead and purchasing or selling Nichse Melug. Who is the owner of the Nichse Melug? Well, the wife has title, the husband has usage. So therefore, again, Ameimar wants to suggest any sale of Nichse Melug is almost always going to be invalid. It's always going, because there is no singular owner of that field. So both say, so now let's just loop this back. We're not finished, but let's loop this back. Remember, what are we trying to figure out over here? We're trying to figure out, the Mishnah makes a statement. What was the Mishnah statement? A husband cannot make a chazaka in his wife's field. So again, what did the Gemara say to that? Pshita. That's obvious. Of course, again, what is he going to claim? I've been eating peiros for 3 years, uncontested in my wife's field. Shkoyach, you're entitled to that. You're entitled to that. That doesn't give you chazaka. So we'll say, this now leads into an entire conversation essentially about the ability of a wife to sell her husband property, or for a husband and wife to sell property to a third party. So we don't have clarity yet exactly how these things work, but here are the competing issues. Competing issue number one is, although a wife says that she's selling property, and even if they have a shtar to that effect, the concern is she can always claim what? What could she claim? What could she claim? Nachas ruach asisi lebaili. I did not really mean to sell the field. I just wanted to make my husband happy. Okay, which would, of course, it kind of falls. We wouldn't call that coercion, but it falls into the coercion family. Coercion family. The other or the other potential issue is that Ameimar just brought up is that maybe sale of Nichse Melug property in general is problematic because there's no clearly defined owner. One party has usage, that's the husband. The other party has title, that's the wife. And maybe in that type of transaction, you can never really affect a comprehensive real estate transaction. Okay, so let's continue. We're not finished with this yet. And then along the way, we happen to just say, always part of the beauty of what we do Daf Yomi is the opportunity, Baruch Hashem, to pick up little additional nuggets along the way. So now we see this halach of Yoma Yomayim and this fundamental machlokes, who's considered to be the owner in Yoma Yomayim in this interesting case of a sale with a rent back. Okay, let's go weiter. Two dots, 50b. V'lo leish chazaka b'nichsei ishto. So we'll say, so ultimately again, so remember again, this is the same quotation as the Mishnah before, that a husband cannot create chazaka in his wife's property. He says the Gemara, V'hamarav, Eishes ish tzricha limchos. Rav said the following idea. Rav said that a married woman has to make a macha, has to object. Now what does that mean? Take a look at the Rashbam, almost straight across. Eishes ish, the Rashbam says, Shemachzik achar b'nichsei melug shala tzricha limchos mishum da'hu achar yesh lo chazaka im lo michsei v'sidas. We'll say, now watch this. Rachel's married to Ruvain. Rachel has nichsei melug property. Shimon comes along and Shimon starts using her nichsei melug. So what's the halacha? So Rav said that Rachel has to lodge a macha. Everyone say, what's a macha? An objection. What's the objection? What are you doing in my field? Why are you using my field? So if a woman sees someone using her nichsei melug, in order to prevent that person from making a chazaka, she has to lodge a macha. So the Gemara says, biman, who's using her field? Ilema ba'acher, if it's just some guy, just call him Shimon, right? Some random guy. V'hamarav ein machzikim b'nichsei eshes ish. This is fascinating. Rav said, you cannot go ahead and make a chazaka in a married woman's property. Now, this is fascinating. Why can't someone else come along and make a chazaka in a married woman's property? Why not? So the Rashbam says over here, really interesting, right across, Dematzia Amra al Baili Samachti Shuyimcha Vi'arer Velakach Shatakti Ubishabani Adam Dlobal. Comment says, listen to this. Why can't you make a chazaka in a married woman's property? Let's play this out. Rachel's married to Reuven, she has nichsei melug. Shimon comes using the property for 3 years uncontested. Shimon says, I have chazaka. What's the proof? The proof is that Rachel never lodged a macha. What's Rachel's defense? What's her defense? Thought my husband was going to make the macha, right? In other words, she's relying on her husband to make the macha. So therefore, her silence in no way is demonstrative of acquiescence to Shimon's ownership of the property. So we can't be talking about someone else, because in general, there's an inability of someone else to make a chazak on a married woman's property. Elalav bibal. This is saying, rather, what must it be talking about? It must be talking about the husband. So what it must be saying is like this. What Rav is saying is as follows. It must be saying that Rav is saying that a married woman, if she sees her husband utilizing her property in a way that demonstrates ownership, if she wants to prevent him from making a chazaka, then what? She has to make a macha. What does that show you? That a husband can make a chazaka in his wife's property. I will say that contradicts the Mishnah. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Elalab bebal Amar Rava. The Olam Bar Rava says, you're right. We're talking about the husband. So what's the case over here? Kigon shechafar ba boros sichin uma'aros. What's the case, Rabbi Osai? Where you're right. Reuven's married to Rachel, and what does he do? He goes into her nichsei melug and he begins digging pits or caves or cisterns. So we'll say, what is that? What is that? So look at the Rashbam, last of the short lines, the Olam Babal, Shechzik b'nechsei ishto ka'amarav, d'tzricha limchos, sheyesh chazaka labal, va'afilu hachi lo tikshi le'masnisin da'ha chazaka to ka'amarav, kigon shechafer ba'al boros, sichun u'ma'oros. Dileperos hu di'ishta b'lei nechsei melog di'ishto, v'lo le'kilkol ha'karka le'chafiras boros, kigon sadishin asui le'boros, I'm just going to refresh it, v'ilchach yesh chazaka. So we'll say, what's the case? Here we go. Reuven goes on to Rachel's field. Reuven's married to Rachel. They were happily married until tonight, right? And then what happens? She has nichsei melug. So what does he have in her nichsei melug? What does he have? Peros. Excellent. Good. So what does he do? So generally, going to say, if you were to consume peros for 3 years, can he claim chazaka? No. Why? That's his right. So what's the case over here? The case over here is where he goes onto that field and he starts digging wells. Does he have a right to dig wells? No. It's not his right. Okay. So now he's doing something that he doesn't have a right to do, and he's doing that for a protracted amount of time, and it's uncontested. That's called chazaka. That's called chazaka. So in other words, what the Gemara is suggesting is like this. So when Rav comes along and says that a married woman has to make a macha if her husband is using her property, if he's using it in a way that represents his own legal right, peros, no macha is necessary, because again, there's no ownership that's being established. What's the case? Instead of using peros, he starts digging wells or holes or caves, whatever he's digging. He doesn't have a right to do that. And if he does that, and it's uncontested, that establishes chazaka. The Gemara says, but one second. In chazaka. Now let's say, we've already established back in Cheskas Abatim, that's what? The one thing that you don't do is you don't establish chazaka through destructive activity. Right? Why not? Take a look at the Rashbam. Again, it's in the wide lines, about 6 lines. In chazaka l'nizakin, kolomar heicha demachzik lechavero en yochol liton lekuchi biyadi shahari echzakti ba gimel shanim lechafiras baros sichnum aros dechi haygavdo b'havye chazaka demasi toin idach mishum do achazka kitem achazki in shelo chashachus. Watch this. You cannot claim chazaka with a destructive act. Why? Because we'll say chazaka is only established when using the field in a normal fashion. But when you use, which makes sense because chazaka is supposed to be demonstrative of ownership. The assumption is that people take care of their property, people take care of their assets. Therefore, if you go ahead and you use the property in a destructive way, you don't create chazaka. So now we're getting a little bit circular over here. So let's just get with what we know. Mishnah says a husband can't establish chazaka on his wife's property. Rav says that if a woman sees a man making a chazaka on her nichsei milog, she has to make a macha. Who's the man? It can't be some random guy, because a random guy can't make a chazaka on a married woman's property. Why not? Because her lack of macha is not demonstrative of ownership, because she can say, I rely on my husband. So who's the guy? The guy's her husband. Well, how is a husband making a chazaka on his wife's property? Oh, he's doing something destructive. Well, I should say he's digging pits, right? Because that's not, in other words, his entitlement is peros. He's doing something that is outside of the scope of his entitlement, and therefore Allah Chalamai said that is demonstrative of ownership. But one second, we just said in Cheskas Abatim that you can't create chazaka through a destructive act. So how is he able to establish chazaka over here? Well, so here we go. Ein din chazaka l'nizakin. Oh, watch this. The Gemara says, no. So you have to pay attention here. The Gemara says, what does it mean, ein chazaka l'nizakin? Ein din chazaka l'nizakin. They both say, in order to establish chazaka, how long do you normally need? 3 years. If you're doing something dramatic, and you're doing that dramatic thing in the presence of the owner, and the owner does not object, you can establish chazaka instantaneously. So when we say that a destructive act does not establish chazaka, that's not what it means. It means a destructive act is not subject to the regular laws of chazaka. The regular laws of chazaka require me to assert ownership over the course of 3 years. But if I'm doing something destructive, that's dramatic. If I do that in the presence of the current owner or the previous owner of the field, that establishes chazaka when? How long does it take? Immediately. Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Ema ein din chazaka letztarech gimel shanim l'nizakin hecha dechaskaso ayedei nezikin ela li'alter havye chazaka. So I'll say if you do something destructive in a field that establishes chazaka and there's no macha, that establishes chazaka immediately. The ein adam roa, literally again he changes it over here in the Hagos Tziyunim. The ein adam roa shemazikin karka shalo v'shosek. Because we'll say a person would never allow something destructive to occur to his property and not say something. Ella mochem yad v'hecha de lo mocha hefsid v'hilchas. So therefore, if we pull this all together, listen to this. V'hilchach eishes ishtekam rav derav tzricha limchos miyad hu tzricha limchos me'achar shechover ba'baros she'ein adam ra. So we'll say, watch this. So here now we've interpreted the case. What's the case of where a woman is obligated to make a macha if her husband is using her property in order to prevent her from becoming the owner when he's doing something destructive? If he's just eating peros, you don't need a machal because that's his right. But if he does something destructive, normally again, when you do something destructive in the presence of the previous owner, the previous owner says nothing, that is demonstrative of your newfound ownership. So therefore, if Reuben goes over to Rachel's nichsei milug and he starts digging pits, and Rachel says nothing, that is demonstrative of the husband's ownership. And if Rachel wants to prevent her husband from making a chazaka on this field through a destructive act, what does she have to do? What does she need? Macha. She needs to object. Another possibility is, Lav itmar Allah. The other possibility is, when do we say that a destructive act does not establish chazaka? That's, for example, bakutra. Literally, again, you set up a kiln that starts producing smoke. Rav Zavid Amar Beis Hakise. Or for that matter, again, you set up a bathroom. Those type of destructive acts will not establish chazaka. But perhaps, again, a destructive act which is actively involved, in the actual usage of the land itself, that will go ahead and establish chazaka. Rabbi Yossi says, no. Both said last piece. We're almost there. I need 4 minutes, and we'll be there. Rabbi Yossi Amar, the olam ba'achar. Rabbi Yossi says, no, scratch that. When Rav said before that if a married woman wants to prevent a man from making a chazaka or a nichsei mulog, it's not her husband. It's a regular guy. But 1 second, we just said a regular guy can't make a chazaka in a married woman's property. Why not? Because her silence is not demonstrative of acquiescence. Why? Because why was she silent? She was assuming who was going to take care of it? Her husband. So what's going on over here? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi Amar the olam ba'achar. Could go sha'achla. This is very interesting. Sha'achla miktzas chazaka b'chay habal v'shalosh li'achar misas habal. This is very interesting. I will say the case over is as follows. So Rachel is married to Ruvain, and what happens? Shimon comes along, and while Ruvain is alive, Shimon goes ahead and uses the property uncontested. After Ruvain dies, husband dies, Shimon uses the field for another 3 years under Rachel's watch. And Rachel never says anything. So I will say, in a case like this, if Rachel never made a macha about Shimon's use, Shimon could establish a chazaka. Why? This is great. I mean, not for Rachel, but it's interesting. Migo di boy amarla, because he could have said to her, Ana zavinta minach. So I will say, remember again, when could a married woman claim that her silence is not acquiescence? When her husband is alive. If her husband is alive, then she could claim, I was relying on my husband to go ahead and make the macha. Oh, he didn't, I didn't know, I thought he did it. He didn't do it? Okay, I'm sorry, but I don't agree, you're not the owner. So that works well. She could claim that when her husband's alive. When her husband is no longer alive, the obligation of macha falls upon her. So watch this case. Rachel is married to Ruvain. Shimon uses that property for a year while Ruvain is alive. Then Ruvain dies. After Ruvain dies, Shimon uses the field uncontested for another 3 years. The Gemara says in that case, Rachel's failure to make a macha allows Shimon to assert chazaka. Why? Because Shimon has a migo. What's his migo? His migo is, I could have just said, I used the field for 3 years once you became a widow. In other words, it's an easy case. His migo is, we can even forget about Ruvain. I used this field uncontested for 3 years when you were no longer married, when you were widowed, and you never contested it. So he says, Migo di by amarla ana zavinta minach. I could claim, right, Shimon could claim, Rachel, I bought it from you after your husband died. Kiamrle nami at zavinta le. But when he makes the claim to say that Rachel, you sold it to Ruvain and I bought it from Ruvain, ultimately again Shimon is believed. So I will say this is just a classic case of migo. So if Shimon's coming along and claiming, so I will say the case in question would then be that halacha l'maisa, Rachel has a field, and let's just bring it all together. So Rav is saying like this. Rav is saying that Rachel has an obligation to make a macha about her property in order to prevent someone else from making a chazaka. We're just trying to figure out what that case is. So we know what the case is not. The case is certainly not going to be a case of her husband using peiros, because there's an obligation of macha, because that is considered to be normative usage. So we have two different possible interpretations of the case. Possibility one is that it's talking about her husband. So what would be a case where Rachel would be obligated to make a macha against her husband's usage of her nichsei mulog? What would be the case? Of where he's doing something destructive. Because the performance of a destructive act in the presence of the former owner is in and of itself an assertion of ownership. Right? Because otherwise, if I was the owner, I wouldn't let someone be destroying my field. If the person is doing a destructive act, that's clearly demonstrative that they're the owner and I am not. So that would be a case where if Rachel was the owner and Reuven was doing something destructive, even though it's her husband, she should be obligated to make a macha in order to prevent him from asserting chazaka. Or the other possibility is no. We're talking about a case where the person, the man, asserting chazaka over her property is another guy. And what's the case about saying? The case, interestingly enough, is where he claims, Rachel, I bought this field from your husband. Now what's the background to the case? The background to the case is that Shimon used the field for 1 year when Reuven was alive. He used it for another 3 years after Ruvain died, and it was under the watch of Rachel, and now he's claiming that he bought it from Ruvain. So Shimon is believed in that case. Why is Shimon believed in that case? Because he can make a migo. What's his migo? He could have totally left Ruvain out of this, and what could he have claimed? He could have just simply claimed that he bought this from Rachel. Because after all, again, her husband's dead, so she can no longer claim that I was relying on someone else to make the macha. He used it for 3 years uncontested, could have made the claim that Rachel, I bought it from you. The fact that he makes a different claim that says, I bought it from Ruvain, that's why I used it for a year under Ruvain, now 3 years under you, that migo allows him to be believed. So therefore, again, this justifies Rav's statement that even though normally we say a married woman doesn't have to make a macha when it comes to her own property because she can rely on her husband, there are exceptions to that. And one exception case would be in the case of the husband himself when he does something destructive. Other exception case would be a case of where someone begins to use the property during the lifetime of the husband, but continues to do that even after the husband died. So what we are still left with, just what we're still left with over here, is at the end of the day, the Mishnah tells me a rule. And the rule that the Mishnah tells me is that a husband cannot make a chazaka in his wife's property, just like we'll see a wife can't make a chazaka in her husband's property. What we still have to iron out, right? The piece that we still have to iron out is halacha l'maisa. So what is the status of what we'll call spousal sales? That didn't sound right. What's the status? What's the status of property sales between spouses? How does that work? How does that work? Is it truly possible for a wife to sell her husband property? And again, we'll talk about the reverse as well. And the corollary to that is, what's the status ultimately when husband and wife together share or sell their respective rights to a third party? Does such a sale work or not? Again, those two things are still outliers. Ibn Hashem to be resolved in our next Shavosai. Shkoyach. All right, well, so mind this, there's no shir tomorrow morning. I don't know, what day is it today? It's Tuesday. Right? You want to daven? Anyone want to daven now? We can daven.